Can you hear me? I'm going to start in a minute. This is the first of a series of 24 talks in which I'm going to condense my work over the last 50 years in foreign policy activism. It covers the 50 chapters in these two books, in which I worked in 10 countries, including China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, America, of course, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Peru. And these talks are designed to show you what it means to be a foreign policy activist. I'm going to combine the history of the issue involved with the personal struggles and developments that led me into these problems, and with the luck, skill, and lack of luck that determined the outcome. And at the end of the lecture, I'm going to give the moral of what actually happened, what it all means. This is perhaps the most important thing that I accomplished. I think you know that scientists, when they go into a new field, they often make their best discoveries at the outset. They see things in a different way than everybody else, and that was the case for me. This treaty that I'm going to talk about today was the most important treaty of the 40-year Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. It lasted for 30 years, and it took 10 years from the time I thought of it to the time it was agreed. This is the signing of the treaty in which, in 1972, President Nixon signed for our side, and the Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Brezhnev, signed for the Russians. What I'm going to explain is, in this first talk, is what happened during the 10 years between the time I first thought about this and the time this was ratified. But this wasn't the end of the struggle involving anti-ballistic missiles. There were two other problems that arose over the next 40 years, and the next two talks will continue to talk about them. One of them involving Ronald Reagan and Star Wars, and another one involving the second George Bush and the tearing up of the treaty. Now, it all started for me when Kennedy met with Khrushchev, and this was 2 months after the Bay of Pigs, when Kennedy had blundered into following the course of action that the Eisenhower administration had left for him. And he was afraid, with some justice, that Khrushchev would think he was a young, callow person and not strong. And Khrushchev came on very strong in this meeting just 2 months after the Bay of Pigs. And Khrushchev said, I'm going to turn over access to Berlin to the East Germans. And you'll be, in effect, stuck with what the East Germans tell you what to do. Now, 11 years before, you know, Stalin had tried to blockade access to Berlin. And there had been a tremendous struggle to feed the people of Berlin. You see, when the war ended, the Russians were sitting on East Germany and the West was sitting on West Germany, but Berlin, the capital of Germany, was in the middle of the East German sector. And according to the agreement that was reached at the end of the war, there was supposed to be access by all the Allied powers to Berlin. Stalin threatened to stop that, and the West had to fly food in to circumvent the blockades on the roads from the West to Berlin, and had to beat this down with a tremendously unusual series of aerial flights. So 12 years later, Khrushchev came back to the same theme, and he said, well, we're going to take over West Berlin, in effect, by giving the East Germans this right to control the access. And Khrushchev said, force will be met by force. If the U.S. wants war, that's its problem. Kennedy said, okay, there'll be a war. It'll be a cold winter, a long winter. And At that time, some of you may remember, fears of war were widespread. People were building fallout shelters. And children were being told to duck and cover under your desk if the alarm is given. So these were frightening times. And at that point, a friend of mine, my best friend, the best man at my wedding, and my roommate, this man, Cindy Winter, intervened in my life. He was working then at the Rand Corporation. He said he was working with a man who was setting up a new institute on war and peace, and that he had recommended me to that person, and would I like to work for him. This was over a radio from a ship, and he said, over, and we were having a rather difficult conversation while I tried to understand what he had in mind. And at that time, I had my PhD in mathematics. I was working at the Stanford Research Institute. I was waiting for BJ, my wife, to get her PhD. And I wasn't that happy at the Stanford Research Institute. So I was thinking about this. The problem was that this man, who was the director of the Hudson Institute, the man that my roommate wanted me to work for, was considered evil by all my friends and my father, because he was giving lectures and writing an enormous book on how you could threaten and even win a nuclear war. And to some people, the idea of threatening and trying to win a nuclear war was bizarre. One of my family friends had written an article in Scientific American saying, could there really be a Herman Kahn? But Herman had a very thick book on thermonuclear war, and he was giving 3-day lectures on everything that was in it. Now, my friend Sid said, well, Herman's the smartest person to the right of me that I've ever met, and he has influence in Washington, and if you can influence him, you might be able to influence Washington. So I decided to try. I left Stanford Research Institute. I went to New York, to Elmsford, and started working at the Hudson Institute. I was confronted as my first job. Herman said, we've got this problem. We have a contract. It's with the Civil Defense Agency of the Pentagon. We've had it for 8 months, and we have 2 months left. Not a word has been put to paper. We want you to write up this contract. It doesn't have to be great, just good. I said, what's it on, Herman? He said, strategic evacuation. Well, I gave serious thought to quitting. I had just arrived. But I gave serious thought to leaving because fallout shelters were a prudential thing. You know, if there was a war, you went into a fallout shelter, well, maybe you'd be better off. But strategic evacuation, Herman's idea, was a way to use civil defense to threaten nuclear war. He wanted me to do a plan of how you could evacuate the cities in the United States. So we could tell the Russians, in this crisis, we can blow up all your people who are still in their cities, but you won't be able to blow up all our people, because if your missiles hit the cities, the people will be elsewhere. That was his idea. I thought this fantastic and dangerous. But I had just arrived, so I decided to do this study. And it involved looking at maps like this is the map of New York City. You count the roads. How many lanes are there? If they're all outbound, how many cars can go how fast when they're all traveling together? How many people can be in each car? How many days would it take to empty New York City? And where would they go? I mean, there aren't that many motels, you know. So this was the problem I was working on. But I counted the roads, talked to people about in rainy weather, how fast can you drive, things like that. Wrote a study. Went down to the Pentagon to brief them. My friend Sid Winter was laughing because he saw me briefing the Pentagon with enormous briefing charts, which Herman was carrying. I explained to the head of the Office of Civil Defense what I had done, and then he said, to my great surprise, he said, well, Dr. Stone, do you think this would actually work? Oh, I said, I'm so glad you asked. I don't think so at all. I felt a tremendous sense of relief. I realized that Herman thought this was a great idea, but nobody else thought it was a great idea, even in the Pentagon. At this point, the Cuban Missile Crisis intervened. You all remember it was very dangerous. And it was so dangerous, so much like a scenario for nuclear war occurring, that people in the research institutes like me thought this is the end of the world. And I drove to Princeton, where my wife was, just so we'd be together if the world ended. And Leo Szilard, the inventor of the atomic bomb, he left for Switzerland because he thought that'd be a safe place. You know, I mean, everybody had been thinking about nuclear war was panic-stricken. Well, about that time, Hudson Institute, which had Herman Kahn as its director, hired a president, and it was this man, Donald Brennan, on the left. And this is me on the right. That's what I looked like 50 years ago. Thinner and more callow. And Brennan was interested in arms control, at least at that time. So the Institute was more balanced. Now, I'm getting to the point of where I had my great idea. I knew at this institute that the Russians were starting to build an anti-ballistic missile system around the town of Tallinn in Estonia. This is along the route that American missiles would fire if they were going to Moscow. You see, this is Tallinn right there. I'm going to practice using one. There's Tallinn. That's where the anti-ballistic missile system was. That's Finland above there. And the missiles would go over Estonia, which was then under Soviet control. They had captured Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And Moscow was here, and they were hoping this ABM system, which they were testing, would protect Moscow. That was their test anyway. And at that time, the United States was also working on anti-ballistic missile systems. This was the Nike Zeus. We, in fact, were testing it 2 years before. So everybody was thinking about this, but they hadn't done anything. I was sitting in my attic in Elmsford, and I had this blinding flash. The idea was that if the Russians could be talked out of doing this, maybe we could talk the Americans out of doing this, and then maybe nobody would do it. And the reason I wanted nobody to do it was I was absolutely convinced that these systems would not work. They were expensive, that was for sure. But in order to protect a country against nuclear war, you would have to shoot down 90% of all the missiles that were fired at you, because the Russians had plenty of missiles. And we only had about 50 large cities. The idea that we could find missiles in space and shoot them down in the last 10 minutes of their flight, it seemed science fiction. I never thought it would work. And to this day, it has not worked. So I thought this is a waste of money. And in any case, if it did work, what would happen? Well, the other side would build still more missiles. So this would be a new layer of the arms race. We were already racing in numbers of warheads and numbers of missiles. To add on to this a new overlay of racing in anti-ballistic missiles seemed to me foolhardy in the extreme. So I wrote a paper, should the Soviet Union build an anti-ballistic missile system? The answer to the paper was no. And I delivered this paper in Michigan to a conference on war and peace where there was one Russian. So this was the beginning of my effort to talk the Russians into not doing it. And this idea was so important that my boss, Donald Brennan, that large man you saw, he wrote a letter to Adam Yarmolinsky, who was the chief assistant to Secretary of Defense McNamara. And he said, Jeremy's paper is important and interesting enough to be brought to the Secretary's attention. Did anyone in the Pentagon want to comment on this before he showed it to the Russians? So I was very happy. I thought, this is what I came to Hudson Institute for. I'm having some effect. My ideas are going to the Secretary of Defense. For an activist, this was heaven. And then I wrote a second paper, Anti-Ballistic Missiles and Arms Control, in which I developed the whole idea in great detail. What would it cost? What would it save? How many this and that? All the ins and outs. And Herman Kahn, who was less sympathetic, of course, to what I was doing, this paper, it led to two things. First of all, Herman Kahn said, we've got a guy on our board called Freeman Dyson. He's a very famous physicist, one of the most famous physicists in the world, and still is today. And he was at the Institute for Advanced Study. And Freeman doesn't agree with you. So you should go down there and talk to him. He hoped that Freeman would talk me out of this. That's Freeman Dyson. And he's 82, but just had an article this month in the New York Review of Books. He's a very brilliant man. So I went to see him, doffed my hat, explained my position. Freeman said, well, I was calling him Dr. Dyson at the time. Dr. Dyson said, why don't the Russians like defense? Why don't we let them do it? Let them waste their money. What difference does it make? I said, well, Dr. Dyson, if they build one, we'll feel obliged to build one too. And he said, I never thought of that. He was a real scientist, you know, and that's the way the scientists are, you know, candid and honest about this. So I went back, said to Herman Kahn, Freeman says he never thought about this. And in fact, Freeman, though a great physicist, was, as far as I was concerned, wrong on 3 other things involving military things. So he was a great scientist and a great cosmologist, but not so great in arms control. The second thing that happened was Brennan had started a group, a private group, that was talking with the Russians, of senior Americans talking to senior Russians about arms control. They had a letter from the Kennedy administration, from McGeorge Bundy, saying you can do this so long as it doesn't get out in the press and doesn't cause a big fuss, we'll back you. And and Brennan knew this group, he had started this group, and he told them about my paper, and they said, well, we'll give Stone $1,000 if he will let us use the paper at our next meeting with the Russians in Cambridge. So I said, well, look, I don't need the money. It was about $7,000 in today's money. I said, I don't want the money, but I'll let them use the paper if I can present it to the Russians, which for me was, you know, nirvana. So they were a pretty famous group. Henry Kissinger, then a professor at Harvard, was one of them. This man, Jerome Wiesner, was the president of MIT and had just been the science advisor to President Kennedy. This man, Marshall Schulman, was a very diplomatic expert on Soviet affairs, later became the expert advisor to Secretary of State Vance. And this was a biochemist who was in charge of the group. So they agreed to let me do this, and they had 4 Russian visitors. One of them was General Kolinsky. Now, General Kolinsky was a Russian general, but he was really an historian general. I wouldn't have considered him a real general. I learned later he was the link between these arms controllers in Russia, these scientists in Russia, and their Pentagon. They had to have a general in their group to, you know, so the generals in their Pentagon wouldn't get too worried about what was going on. And he said, when I gave my talk, he said, if this is a threat, I'm going to put on my hat and go home. Meaning, if you're saying we are not allowed to build an anti-ballistic missile system, you know, you can't tell us what to do. And Marshall Schulman, the diplomat, said, oh, you misunderstand. Jeremy's explaining that inevitably we would be building one too. We're not threatening you. We're just warning you about, you know, what would happen. So that was the first thing that happened. And they all took the view that they couldn't do this. They said, look, we've been through a terrible war with the Germans. 1 person in 10 was killed in Russia during that war. It's much more serious for them than for here. The whole country in Russia was decimated. And if we told people we're not going to buy a defensive system, they'd think we were crazy. We just can't sell this. That was the general tenor. And after the talk was over, I went up to the leader of the group, Milyonchikov, who was the vice president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. And I said, well, academician Milyonchikov, at least one Soviet academician, that's their highest rank of scientist, at least one Russian academician agrees with me. Look what Artsemovich said some years ago. He said a defensive system could be even more dangerous than an offensive system. And Milyonchikov, without turning a hair, said, oh, Dr. Stone, Artsemovich always disagrees with everybody else. So that was the first day, and the next morning, Vasily Emlyanov, a very sweet man, a metallurgist who had been their representative to the International Agency for Atomic Energy, came down and he told me a joke that Henry Kissinger had just told him. Henry Kissinger had told him about a Texas sheriff. And the Texas sheriff was beating communists, you know. He had found a den of communists and he was beating them. And one of them said, "Don't beat me, I'm anti-communist." And the sheriff had said, "I don't care what kind of a communist you are," and continued to beat them. So the Russians thought this was very funny and, you know, typical of Texas sheriffs. And so Ulyanov came down to breakfast and he told the same story to me in broken English, and he said, "That's the way you are, Stone. You don't care. Missiles, anti-missiles, you beat them all." Which of course was entirely accurate. And then he told me that I should learn Russian if I wanted to get into this business. And I immediately told my wife, "Well, you should learn Russian. One of us should know Russian, and it should be you." So I began a career that my father once labeled as a linguistic white slaver, because later I required her to learn some Chinese and later some Spanish. So I left languages to her. And I moved from Hudson Institute, where Herman Kahn was driving me crazy, to Harvard. And I spent 2 years there, and I wrote 2 books. This book, containing the arms race, was reviewed in the Washington Post, and they said that I had made a detailed case in favor of a freeze and a pause in the procurement of missile and anti-missile systems, with a fairness to opposing viewpoints, which is quite rare, they said, in the messianic world of the megatons. So I was being recognized as having put forward this proposal. And the second book was about how to persuade governments of your ideas. This book, Strategic Persuasion, was about how do you persuade organizations like the management of Costa Glen, or governments like the Soviet government, of your idea. And the conclusion of my book was, you can't get very far telling them the idea from outside. But if you can find somebody in the management of the organization who agrees with you, or in the government of the Soviet Union who agrees with you, and give them the idea and tell them how to sell it, then they can pull the levers from the inside and you can infect the entire organization. Just don't tell the Costa management that I have this strategy in mind and everything will be fine. By the time I had spent 2 years at Harvard and BJ had learned some Russian, we decided to take our case to Russia. And this was motivated in part by the fact that the senior American arms controllers didn't think that much of me, and when they went to Pugwash meetings, which was the main meeting group which met with Russians and other foreigners on arms control, they didn't invite me. And this was a stroke of luck on my part, although it was disheartening for me. They didn't do it because really they were very senior people. They had been, you know, famous people like science advisor to Kennedy or head of the Institute for Defense Analyses. They were famous scientists, senior people, and they, I think, weren't sure I had that much to offer. Anyway, I wasn't breaking through there. So I decided with BJ to go directly to Russia to present my ideas. And this turned out to be much better, because the other groups were meeting this time in Ethiopia, next time in Hungary, next time somewhere else. It was a traveling circus, and they were only able to meet with the Russians who were sent to meet with them. And these were elderly Russian scientists who really knew very little. And so they weren't much to talk to. And I think one of the reasons I wasn't asked to these meetings was because people realized, I couldn't hide it, that I had a sort of negative view about how well these Pugwash American groups were doing. And, you know, they had to ask me for my paper. They weren't writing their own papers. They were winging it. And so BJ and I started going to Russia, and we introduced ourselves to this woman, Nina Shakova, who was an English teacher and had befriended Donald Brennan, my boss, who had been there a year or two before. And so he gave me her name. And this was her mother, and this was her daughter. And that's BJ in the middle. Her daughter is now a grandmother and runs a translation service. And she translated my next book, the book from which these chapters are being taken, into Russian. So this family befriended us through very difficult times in Russia. It took a lot of courage to do it. So the first time I went to Moscow, it was 1966. They weren't used to having people wander in and say, I want to give a lecture. But they had a place called Friendship House, and so they convened a meeting in Friendship House, and I gave a lecture. Well-dressed men came who didn't give their name. I was very pleased about this, because the fact that they were well-dressed meant they were the real thing, and that they didn't give their name meant they were working in secret institutes, and I thought, these are the guys I want to pitch my idea to. And so I presented my ideas, and they said, why shouldn't we build an anti-ballistic missile system? And I said, well, look, America is rich, and we don't mind spending money. And if you build an anti-ballistic missile system, we'll build a bigger one. And by that time, I had read an article that Emelianov had written in a Russian newspaper, and it had said, we told those Americans that we're not going to stop building defensive systems, but he said, you got to admit, if they are built, the capitalists will make a lot of money. So I had learned that this argument seemed to make sense in Russia, so I told these guys also, and the capitalists will make a lot of money. And so did my best. By the next year when we came, we were finding time to come every summer or something. PJ's Russian was getting better. The next time they came, they had realized that there were people like me that wanted to present their ideas, and they had invented an institute called Arbatov's Institute. That's Arbatov right there. And this institute became the place to go to, where American experts on all manner of things went to talk to the Russians, present their ideas. And Arbatov became quite famous, came back here, met with presidents. He became the key link between the outside, between the Americans and the bureaucracy in Russia. And he would go to the Pugwash meetings. He was a breath of fresh air at the Pugwash meetings because he had some political grasp of things. He was a political scientist, and he did much better than the natural scientists that they had previously been inviting. So as a result of these lectures there and my early beginning on this, when Americans got there in 1967 and talked about the anti-ballistic missile and stopping it on both sides, they were told, oh yes, that's Jeremy Stone's proposal. So in Russia, from that time, I became considered to be the father of this treaty. But pretty soon, there were other people involved. Now, the next thing that happened was a frightening thing for me. You know, the Russians, the system there is rather suspicious. And Emelianov, who was friendly to me and who had encouraged us to learn Russian, said to me once, well, Jeremy, one thing. Why don't the American Pugwash people invite you to these Pugwash meetings? I had spoken at one of these special meetings, you know, with just Russians and Americans, but there were many other meetings once or twice a year with scientists from all over, and I wasn't being invited, and he wanted to know why. To me, this meant, is there something the Americans know about you that we don't, like maybe you work for the CIA, you know? So I realized I'd have to come up with a really good answer. And this is the answer I came up with. Once upon a time, I said, Emelianov, there was some experimenters, and they had a colony of chimpanzees. And in the colony of chimpanzees, they put a big machine that produced bananas. But you had to work the machine properly to get the bananas. And they discovered two things. First, they discovered if a senior monkey, like that one, was found to be getting bananas from this machine, all the other chimpanzees would stand around and they would watch what he was doing, they would learn from him, and soon they would be getting their own bananas. But they learned, the other thing they learned was, if in fact a younger chimpanzee, like this one, somehow figured out how to operate the machine and was getting bananas from the machine, nobody stood around, nobody learned anything, they just took his banana. So Emelianov really appreciated this story, and he said, yes, it's just like in Russia. We are always saying, we need new blood in this group. And then someone else says, well, maybe we better wait and make sure it's the right blood type. So they also weren't letting young people in, and that was my answer. Now at this time, McNamara had bought the idea that anti-ballistic missile systems were bad. And he was building multiple reentry vehicles on each missile. Each missile had a lot of warheads coming out of it. One missile would launch, but it could attack 10 different targets. That's what this diagram shows. And McNamara was saying, well, the reason we're doing this is because that'll teach them never to build an anti-ballistic missile system. They'll not only have to shoot down one missile, they'll have to shoot down 10 warheads for each missile that we're deploying. And that was his argument for what was called MIRV, multiple independently guided reentry vehicles. Actually, this turned out to be a very dangerous thing in the course of the arms race because these warheads got more and more accurate, and pretty soon they could not only penetrate anti-ballistic missile systems, they could attack 10 different missiles. One of our missiles could destroy 10 of theirs, at which point the question arose, could we wipe out all their missiles? So this was a dangerous thing when the accuracy caught up. And now, the Republicans in Congress wanted to build an anti-ballistic missile system. The Republican Party, you'll have to excuse me for making this comment, it's the party of the rich, at least the industrialists backed them, the capitalists backed them. Their urge to build an anti-ballistic missile system was tremendous. Pieces of it would have been built in every state. And so the ability to lobby congressmen and senators into building it was strong. And anyway, the Republican Party was, on the whole, for it. And they were putting pressure on Lyndon Johnson and Secretary McNamara to do it. And they didn't want to do it. But the pressure built up to the point where something had to be done. So McNamara went to San Francisco and he gave a speech, which in fact a friend of mine, Morton Halpern, wrote. And it said, anti-ballistic missiles are bad, 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 but we're going to build a small one. And we're not going to build it against the Russians, we're going to build it against the Chinese. Chairman Mao had been talking about how they could survive a nuclear war. They had 1 billion people, and if half of them were dead, the other half would survive. It sounded crazy, and people were persuaded that maybe the Chinese wouldn't obey the normal rules of deterrence, and maybe they would fire at us even though they'd be blown up in return. It was exactly like the debate over Iran today. Maybe they would fire at Israel, even though Israel has a submarine with nuclear weapons and could blow up all of Iran. So they decided to build this system. Now that you would have thought was a defeat for my idea because I was against these systems, but it turned out to be a tremendously successful thing for my campaign for a weird reason. They decided to build this system out of 12 anti-ballistic missile sites, one around Seattle, one around Boston, one around Washington. They found the largest 12 metropolitan areas, and they were going to build this anti-Chinese system around each one. By the way, when McNamara gave the speech, he said the Chinese, well, they don't have missiles now, but by the mid-70s, they may have a modest group of missiles. Actually, that did not turn out to be true. They didn't have this modest group of missiles until the 1990s, 20 years later. So these predictions of where the adversary may be are not so trustworthy. But in any case, they started building this system. Now, I later became the president of the Federation of American Scientists, which was founded by the original atomic scientist, but I wasn't part of it then. But it had chapters around the country, defunct chapters. They hadn't done anything in years. But when this Sentinel ABM system started, they rose up and they started a debate called the bombs in the backyard debate. They said, these missiles that are in the anti-ballistic missile system, they're not just missiles with bombs on the end of them, they have nuclear bombs on the end of them. That means our city, Seattle or Boston, will be ringed by atomic weapons. Our own atomic weapons, maybe, but they still might go off. Do we really want to have bombs in our backyard? So a tremendous political furor was started by these defunct Federation of American Scientists chapters, one of which was in Boston. And Senator Kennedy was persuaded by them that he should oppose the anti-ballistic missile system. At that time, there were only 5 senators in the Senate opposed to it, but by the time Kennedy entered the debate, there were 34. That is, Kennedy brought with him 29 more. So now there was a substantial number, and the government decided they just couldn't go ahead with this Sentinel anti-Chinese ABM system. But the pressures to build an anti-ballistic missile system were still there. And the idea was maybe we can find some other use for it. And they decided, well, I'm skipping a little bit ahead. At about this time, Kosygin, Prime Minister Kosygin, came to America, and he met with Lyndon Johnson and McNamara. That's him. That's Lyndon. That's Kosygin. He was the organized cost-effectiveness man in Russia, and there's McNamara. And Lyndon Johnson said to McNamara, okay, Bob, tell him why he shouldn't build an anti-ballistic missile system. So McNamara started giving him the famous McNamara finger, you know. He started telling him, this is a bad idea for this reason, and this reason, and this reason. And he, you know, he's a very logical man, very forceful. He started giving it the business. And he said to him, you may think, as the Congress apparently does, that a proper response to a Soviet defense is a U.S. defense. But I tell you, the proper response, and it will be our response, is to expand our offensive force. That is, to make sure that your defensive force won't work. So he was telling Kosygin, if you build this ABM, it'll be more arms race, we'll build more missiles. Kosygin turned red, started giving the Russian line. Later, I had a seminar a year and a half ago, a couple years ago, in my basement in Chevy Chase, Maryland. I had the chief of staff of the Russian army there, and I invited McNamara to meet him and have a debate on arms control. And Bob did the same thing. He had something he wanted to tell him. He started waving his finger and saying, this, for this reason, this reason, this. Finally, I said, General Belowevsky, now you know how Premier Kosygin felt at Glassboro. Now, in 1968, I got an opportunity to participate in the debate, a very prestigious place called the Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Knew I was a leading opponent, and they assigned me the task of writing a monograph in their monograph series called The Case Against Missile Defenses. And I wrote this monograph, and they were pleased with it. I bought 1,000 extra copies. I started mailing it to everybody and his brother who was involved in this issue. And I went to Russia, and I bribed a man to translate it into Russian and give it to the head of the medium machine building operation, which is where they were building all their, that was the secret institute where they were building their stuff. So I was determined that they would get this, and in Russian. And then I took a copy of the Russian translation. I went to the U.S. Embassy, and I said, you know, I'm selling my ideas here, and here's a Russian translation of my monograph. They were pleased, but startled. So the people behind the anti-ballistic missile, they were trying to figure out, as I said, some new way to sell this anti-ballistic missile system. And they hadn't succeeded in doing it around cities, and they decided, well, maybe we could use this to defend missiles. Now, we had missile silos here. You see, we had them in North and South Dakota, in Wyoming, and Missouri. It's North and South Dakota, Wyoming, and Missouri. 4 states. They had about 150 missiles in each. I only got 3 of the states here. And these missiles were in concrete, and they were underground. So by this time, the Nixon administration was in power, and Melvin Laird was Secretary of Defense. And he started saying, we gotta defend these missile silos against Russian missiles, because otherwise the Russians could wipe out our missiles in a first strike. Well, it was completely crazy, because A, they couldn't do it, and B, even if they did do it, we had submarines underwater which could not be targeted and had nuclear missiles, and had enough missiles to destroy all of Russia many times over in response. In fact, Melvin Laird's statements were so strong that his mother wrote him a letter saying, Melvin, you're frightening people. So, and then a very brave scientist, a very brilliant scientist, Wolfgang Panofsky, who ran the Stanford Linear Accelerator in San Francisco, did a beautiful job of testifying to the Senate about why this missile system would not defend more than a few missiles, wouldn't make a tinker's bit of difference in the defense of the missiles. And so this idea was beaten down also. At this time, the situation was so crazy that I'll give you an example. I had a chance to debate with Edward Teller. Now, Edward Teller was the father of the American hydrogen bomb. And he agreed to debate me in the University of Pennsylvania if there were no questions asked on either side, back and forth. He didn't want me asking him questions. So he gave his position, I gave my position. And then I said to the organizer, look, could I ask Dr. Teller just one question, just one question? They said, okay. So Teller, I said, Dr. Teller, I just have one question. You say we should build an anti-ballistic missile system. Do you want it to defend our cities or our missiles? What is it you're talking about? Which he hadn't said. So he went up to the microphone, he started rolling up his sleeves as if I'm just going to punch this kid right out of the place. And he said, I am not going to answer this question because the answer is classified. Now, this was so extreme that it was really bizarre because you couldn't classify whether you're putting the missiles in Montana or whether the anti-ballistics in Montana or whether you're putting them near the cities. Everybody would know years before it was built. So what could be classified about it? And when I went upstairs in the elevator, I saw Teller saying to one of the reporters, don't quote what I said there, quote what I said earlier. You know, he realized that this was insane, but you know, that's what he said. I said to my boss who knew Teller, I said, how can this be? The great Edward Teller, he's talking like a maniac. And my boss Brennan said, well, you know, the people who know Teller, they know him, and they know he talks like this, but the people who don't know Teller, they think he's the great God who invented the hydrogen bomb, and they listen to whatever he says. So what we were up against with the anti-ballistic missile is what President Eisenhower was referring to when he gave his farewell address. In the farewell address, as you may remember, General Eisenhower said, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex was so strong that they had produced 5 different rationales for this system. And the first one was to build it against the Russians. But the Russian system of offensive missiles was too powerful. The second one was against the Chinese, but that didn't work because the public didn't want it. The next one was against defending missiles, and that didn't work because it turned out, as Panofsky explained, it wouldn't work and wasn't necessary. And then they said, well, why don't we just build a little research and development site? And nobody wanted that. So by this time, in the Senate, there were almost 50 votes against the anti-ballistic missile, and the Nixon administration came up with a 5th argument. And this 5th argument I supported. It was bargaining chip. They said, if the Senate votes down the anti-ballistic missile, then the Russians will have one and we won't have one at all. But if you vote in support of it and don't vote it down, we promise we will reach agreement with the Russians to ban it on both sides. So you'll succeed in having none here, and you'll also get none in Russia. And when the vote was finally tallied, it was 50 to 50. The tie vote was broken by the Vice President. It was the closest vote in the Senate on armed services matters since World War II. The only vote that had been this close had been on unified universal military training, and the farmers opposed it because they wanted the boys on the farm instead of universal military training. So in between those two votes, 50-50, there was no close vote in the Senate on any military system. Anything the Senate Armed Services Committee wanted, the Senate gave them. This was the first time there had been opposition. And I want to tell you about Henry Kissinger's view on this. In 1964, when I was at the Harvard Center for International Affairs writing those 2 books, Henry Kissinger was one of the 3 men in charge of the center. And one day I heard him walking down the halls And he was talking about me to a member of the visiting committee. And he was explaining this. He said, in this office, we have this kid, Stone. He thinks the anti-ballistic missile is so weak it won't work. But at the same time, he thinks it's so strong, it will destabilize the arms race. And he went, ha ha ha. And I thought, Henry is a brilliant man. He has summarized my position perfectly. That was exactly what I thought. It was too weak to work, but it would destabilize the arms race. So he didn't agree with me, but he understood, at least, what I was pitching. So later, when he became the National Security Advisor, he was heard to say, these people against the ABM, they really knew what they were talking about. And later, he negotiated the treaty. And he began in 1970, and he did it. And you saw the picture where it was negotiated at the beginning. So on the anti-ballistic missile front, everything was quiet now for 11 years. The treaty worked quite well, and nothing happened until Ronald Reagan decided that there should be an anti-ballistic missile system, one that was perfect, and that would shoot down everything. So 11 years after this treaty, he came out with Star Wars. And my next lecture will be how I dealt with the problem that his idea was posing for everything I was trying to achieve. Well, it was a threat to the existence of the anti-ballistic missile system and to arms control generally. So here's the moral. It took 10 years to get this treaty and 5 miracles. The first miracle was really that the Defense Department had McNamara in charge of it, that he grasped the idea, and that they sold it to the Russians. This wouldn't have happened under the Eisenhower administration. They had businessmen running the Defense Department, and these businessmen had no grasp of what they were doing, and the Defense Department was allowed to do whatever it wanted. Like Charlie Wilson, who was from General Electric. His idea was, well, we'll just let every service buy what it wants because they know best what they need, and we'll divide the money up in proportion to the way it was the year before between the services. There was no control over the Defense Department by these businessmen. The second miracle was that there was a public uprising that vetoed the decision of the Johnson-McNamara administration to build the Sentinel missile defense against the Chinese. The public vetoed this. That was a miracle. So that was the second miracle. The third miracle was that a scientist stepped forward and he, defeated the safeguard by explaining to the senators why, in fact, that was not likely to work. And finally, by this time, the Republicans were in the presidency. And this was exactly what we needed, because a Democratic administration could never have persuaded the Republicans in the Senate to vote for the treaty in sufficient numbers. It takes a 2/3 vote in the Senate to approve a treaty. So what happened was really there was an uprising against anti-ballistic missiles under the Democrats. But by the time the treaty had to be negotiated, the Republicans were in charge, and they had the political acumen with their counterparts in the Senate to do it. In other words, the Republicans in the Senate said, well, if Nixon and Kissinger say it's okay, then it's okay, but we're not going to take this from, they wouldn't have taken it from Lyndon Johnson. So that's it. That's what it took to get this most important treaty of the Cold War. No other treaty had this significance, saved this much money, and avoided so much trouble. It took 10 years and 5 miracles. I am now prepared to fend off questions.